Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we are going to look at the second issue of Weird Tales, published in April 1923. So we have another interesting cover, a man being, stunned or killed or something by some beams of light that seem to come. You tell me where. To me, it seems like it comes from two very big nostrils below this pair of eyes. I'm not sure what it's supposed to be, and it's supposed to illustrate the whispering thing. We'll see what it's about later on. Now, the table of content announces that there are 16 thrilling short stories, 2 complete novelettes, and 2 two-part stories, and some interesting, odd, and weird happenings in this issue. So there's fewer stories than last time, though the page count is the same, which tells us that the average length of the stories will be a bit longer. Will the quality be better? Will the quality be worse? Well, let's find out. The first story, The Scar, is more of an adventure tale than anything else. It concerns a young lady who's kidnapped and she is ill. So the kidnappers will get a doctor to try and treat her. He will manage to contact police, save her. There's some action. One thing that's interesting about it is that it's written by a doctor, according to the byline, and there are quite a few details about surgical procedures. The scar from the title is actually the scar from a surgery that the young lady has and that allows someone to identify her. Beyond the Door is about someone whose uncle died in mysterious circumstances. He gets to the site of his death, his house. He can't quite find out from the housekeeper who found the body how he died. Eventually he does find out through the coroner what happened. In the basement there's a well with a slab of stone below it, and the uncle, a thoroughly unpleasant person, killed someone and hid the body there and is haunted either by a real ghost or by his guilt. It's never made clear. And going to look, he lifts up the slab, and as he looks down to see, the slab falls on him, injuring him and trapping him there, so he could not escape and died there after a few days from his injuries. That's the story. We can see a lot of the building blocks that H.P. Lovecraft and other writers would use. Now, that's not to say that this is what inspired H.P. Lovecraft, because by then his first few stories had already been published in The Vagrant a few years before. But we can certainly see there's a trend in the stories of the time, and Lovecraft and some others managed to pull it all together properly, and some of these stories, like Beyond the Door, don't quite get there yet, but we can see they're moving towards there. The Tortoiseshell Comb is narrated from the point of view of a soldier who was court-martialed for the death of his captain. It's set in World War I, and the unit he's a part of is staying in a village. They find out there's an empty house nearby, but it's haunted, and the captain decides he's going to sleep in the house. He goes with the narrator. They find the house empty. The captain finds a bed. It's the very bed that the ghost died in. And then the soldier in question is court-martialed for the murder of the captain, though it was the ghost who did it, and no one wants to believe him. A Photographic Phantasm is about a family whose youngest child dies, and a few months later they take a photograph, and while only the remaining child is in the photo studio, both children appear in the photograph, as though the photograph has managed to see the ghost of the child. The Living Nightmare is about someone who died, and the main character will be staying in the house where he believes the body to be. The family whose house this is actually is going to see some relatives nearby and will be staying there and come back the next day. The protagonist is convinced nothing will happen to him. I mean, what could possibly happen? However, during the night, he hears sounds, things happen, and when he investigates, he finds the body gone, and it shocks him. But it all turns out that the nearby relatives also lived near the cemetery and the body had been taken with them, so there was no body walking around. There's a lot of stories where they build up to something and then they come up with a very mundane explanation. It was all a misunderstanding. It was all a dream. Explanation. The incubus concerns two men who enter a large underground complex, an old one, and here the narration is a little bit unclear to my mind. An accident happens, kills one of them. The other one believes he is the cause of his friend's death and wanders in the darkness of the underground complex, and eventually making his way out with what he thinks is the body of his friend, manages to save him. The atmosphere is well conveyed, but the events not so much. The Body Master concerns another thoroughly unpleasant person who hypnotizes his victims to make them take his revenge on others that he feels has wronged him, either killing them or stealing from them. The narrator is one of the people who is hypnotized, though eventually he will manage to escape and defeat the Body Master. It's a well-told tale. It could have ramped up the suspense a little. Jungle Death concerns someone who runs a plantation. He's doing okay, but could be doing better, and there's a nearby competitor who'd like to take him over and who hires a voodoo doctor to scare off his workers, because if he has no workers, he can't harvest. If he can't harvest, he can't sell. If he can't sell, he goes bankrupt. He manages to find out what happens, exposing him as a fraud who is manipulating the workers. That's about it, really. The Snake Fiend is another story by Farnsworth Wright. As a reminder, he's the person who would eventually become the editor of Weird Tales. This tale concerns a thoroughly unpleasant amateur herpetologist who will use snakes to try and enact his revenge against a couple who he feels has wronged him. It will fail. Seeing them a few days later, he will believe they are ghosts. He will break down and confess to his crime, much to their disgust, because they thought him a friend. It's competently written, but I didn't get into it all that much. Again, it's one of those stories of strange, weird, but not supernatural or fantastic in any way. A Square of Canvas is another story with a thoroughly unpleasant protagonist. He's an artist who is average at best and manages to produce a few very good pieces that impress everyone around him. What only very few people know is the unpleasant source of inspiration for these pieces, specifically death and blood. His last masterpiece, The Square of Canvas in question, his source of inspiration is his young wife. He's gone mad. He tells a story and he shows the person he tells the story to his masterpiece, which is that square of canvas. Here we have another one of the elements I mentioned earlier. There was the emotions somebody feels when confronted with horror. It's well written. The main character is very, very unpleasant. I think that's what makes it well written. You really dislike this guy completely because he's a psychopath. The Affair of the Man in Scarlet is set in 13th century France. It's set in a village where the executioner has to carry out an execution on a woman. Somebody loves her, would like to save her, finds a legal loophole, which requires the cooperation of the executioner. He agrees to, however, things don't turn out the way the woman's lover would like. So I didn't really get into this story. It's filled with anachronism. It's written a little bit clunkily. It could have used some more editing. The Hideous Face, yet another unpleasant character, appears in the guise of an acquaintance of the narrator. The narrator talks about a chance meeting. They chat a bit. As they walk around town, they cross paths with somebody whose face is disfigured, but only on one side, which shocks the narrator and shocks the unpleasant person even more. And then we come to find out that he is the one who did this to the disfigured man out of jealousy. At the end of the story, he is found dead with only half his face bashed in. We know who did it. I have to say I didn't really feel bad for the person, but there we go. The 40 jars, the main characters end up in Mongolia near some lepers. They find out that there are 40 jars in some tomb that contain some powder that is either a cure or a preventative for leprosy. They escape their situation, but decide at the end they're going to come back to try and get the content of these jars. The Wish, while it's called a fragment of fiction, is a complete very short story. This is the entire story here, and is for some reason not in the table of contents. And it's about the unintended consequences of a wish. We've seen this kind of story before, but this one has an interesting twist, and it is very well written. The writer is a journalist, and this is the only story by her that ever appeared in Weird Tales. I quite enjoyed this one. The Whispering Thing is the cover story. We see another aspect of what would become a mainstay in pulp fiction, which is the nickname of a character. So you can think of the Shadow, you can think of the Man of Bronze, Doc Savage, you can think of many of these things. At the time, people threw a lot of stuff against the wall to see what would stick. We remember the good ones, either because the name is good or because the stories were good. But this one here is the Terrible Frog, a French detective. So we can see where the nickname comes from, but it doesn't really do much for me. It's an investigative tale of a murder, actually of several murders. The twist is that they're done by something that's invisible to the eye. So some people actually witness the murders, and what they see is somebody struggling against thin air, apparently. I don't know how it ends, because the conclusion will be in the next issue. I'll let you know more about it when we look at that issue. The Thing of a Thousand Shapes. This is the conclusion of the story that was started in the previous issue. The main character, William Ansley's, his uncle died. He goes at once to his house, where he witnesses a lot of strange supernatural events. He will eventually find out his uncle is not dead, but in a state of suspended animation, although everyone believes him to be dead. There are no signs of decomposition on the body. A medium is used in order to talk with the uncle. The uncle tells him that he will wake in time. The twist is that there are some locals who, in reaction to some strange happenings in the area, believe the dead uncle to be a vampire and will attempt to run a stake through his heart and or burn him. Of course, either one would kill the uncle, so they have to prevent that from happening. The Conquering Will concerns a young man who has to leave his fiancée for almost a year because he has to go and inspect a prospector's claim of tungsten ore in northwestern Canada. On the way there, they have an accident. His traveling companions die. He barely survives and makes his way to an empty cabin just in time for a blizzard with no supplies, no firewood. He will eventually succumb to his injuries and to the cold. His spirit, however, will live on, make its way back to his love. He manages to enter the body of somebody else, resuscitated by the doctors. However, his personality is changed because, of course, now the spirit that inhabits the body is different. He will woo his former fiancée, who does fall in love with him because her new husband reminds her so much of her dead first love. An interesting story. The middle part where the spirit is floating around could have been developed a little bit further so that we see a little bit better how the mechanics of inhabiting a body works. It's quite good. 6 Feet of Willow Green. Well, it's a willow green snake that some Chinese person keeps, claiming the reincarnated soul of his dead wife is in the snake. It's told from the point of view of a European sailor who becomes addicted to opium. The Chinese person in question is his pusher. I just couldn't get into this story at all. We see where pulp fiction will go, but we also see some of the things that are attempted that end up being dead ends, and this is one of them. It's not only the success that guides future writers, it's also the failures. The Hall of the Dead is about an Egyptologist who has to hire a new secretary. His former secretary has disappeared mysteriously, leaving all her belongings behind. He calls the police, gets them to investigate, they find nothing, but eventually he has to hire a new one, and he hires Annette, who is quite competent. He's quite happy with her. The Hall of the Dead is a large room that he uses as an office and where he keeps all his Egyptian artifacts in, so tablets and other things like that, but also a few sarcophagi and mummies. The twist is that after a few months, there's a dinner party. Two of the guests show up early, and this is when we find out that Annette is the sister of the disappeared secretary. And she is running a sting operation on the Egyptologist, who is suspected by her and a few others to be the cause of the disappearance of her sister. They are correct, and they find her body mummified. And it turns out the Egyptologist believes she was the reincarnation of his love in a previous life in, where else? Ancient Egypt. It's a well-written story, a very interesting twist, which we really don't see coming. I quite enjoyed it. The Parlor Cemetery is told from the point of view of a man who goes door to door collecting information for the city directory. He knocks on the door of this old lady who will be a bit of a challenge to get her name and other information from for the directory. Part of that process will be her talking about her dead husbands and how she keeps their ashes on her mantle. She's got 5 dead husbands. They all died in various ways. It doesn't look like she's the cause of it, but rather than regular urns, she keeps them in containers that she feels reminds her of them. So the one whose last name was Mason, and who was a mason, she keeps in a mason jar. And it's all like that. It's not really funny. It's not that grisly. The Golden Glow is about 2 men going into the country for fishing. They come across an abandoned house, which they decide to go check out. However, there's an old lady who threatens them with a gun. They manage to talk their way out of the situation they got themselves into. They leave, stopping for gas a little bit after they talk to people. They're told, no, nobody lives there. It turns out there's a train wreck nearby. The local district attorney will go and check things out. During the night, they'll see a group of men go to the train wreck, enter one of the wagons that's overturned. They will go and have a confrontation. There's a shootout. Some will be killed, the others arrested. And it turns out the wagon they got into had a load of turnips, so they don't really understand why until they dig through the turnips and find cases of whiskey. And it turns out that the old lady was actually one of the smugglers who was disguised, who was making sure nobody was going to be in the house so that they could move the whiskey to the house and then eventually bring cars to drive it away. There we go. Overall, fairly forgivable story, but we see the prohibition showing up here. The Eerie was the editorial/letters column for Weird Tales. So they mention the number of congratulatory letters they've received. They talk about the success of the first issue and how they're still going strong and things are going well. There are letters from a variety of readers giving their thoughts on various stories in the first issue. Then we have a few advertisements, and it's the end of the issue. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, looking at the second issue of Weird Tales, published in April 1923. And I'll see you next time.